Hi, good evening. We'll get started. I want to call the meeting to order for the Oxnard Public Works and Transportation Committee for February 25th, 2025. Madam Clerk, may we have the roll call and posting of the agenda followed by the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
Chair MacArthur.
Here.
Committee Member Basua.
Here.
Committee Member Teran.
Here.
The agenda for this meeting was posted in the kiosk at City Hall, the Oxnard Public Library, the City Administrative Offices, and also on the city's website on Thursday, February 18th. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem, do you want to lead us on the pledge, please? Okay.
Please stand and face the flag. Place our hand over our heart. Repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. The next item on the agenda is public comments for items not on the agenda. Madam Clerk, do we have any public speakers?
Mayor, we have one speaker virtually. Let's see if they're wanting to speak on this particular item. Caller ending in 4018, please press *6 to unmute and start. You can introduce yourself if you'd like, and you have 3 minutes starting now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. This is on items not on the agenda?
Hi. Correct.
Okay, please start.
Oh, hi. Good evening, Chair and committee members, staff, and the public. My name is Doug Portello. I'm a 38-year resident of Oxnard. I'm the former chair of the Cabrillo Neighborhood Council, and I'm the founder of the Oxnard Grassroots Volunteers. The topic I want to speak to the committee this evening is about the public space landscaping on the perimeter of the Cabrillo neighborhood. So for over 4.5 years, I have been helping to restore the public space landscaping on the perimeter of Cabrillo. And there's weeks and months that I was out there 8 hours or more a day, full time. So I'm intimately have knowledge of that landscaping and the issues with it. So one of the concerns I have with the landscaping are the sprinkler heads that are not the pop-up kind. And I brought this attention to Joe Perez when he was overseeing that area, and Sergio. I brought it up to Steve Hallett and Michael Wolf that somebody goes by and maliciously breaks the sprinkler heads. And so I had recommended that those sprinkler heads be changed to the pop-up style. So they're more expensive, but I just think it's more expensive to send a crew out there and keep, changing those out once they've been broken. So the other issue is the water valves themselves on the perimeter. There's several of them, and none of them have the protective encasement, the metal box that goes over them. So I'm also concerned that a member of the public may have access to those valves, turning them off, turning them on. So that's something that I have noticed out there and needs attention. I brought it to the attention of Public Works in the past. Another issue is that when it rains, and we've had rain recently, that the city policy is that the sprinkler system be turned off when there's an anticipation and a good likelihood of rain. And I've noticed that it's gone on, and even when it's raining. And so I don't know who's in charge of that, but that's something that, it's a waste of water. And also it's not good for the plants, because too little water is bad, but too much water is also bad. I had brought to the attention of the City Council and Public Works a suggestion that I could take the green waste from my volunteer effort to the dump and do that myself rather than having staff resources, do that last step of the process. That was rejected as an idea. And then Michael Wolf had recommended that I use the 311 app. And so on 2 occasions I've used the app, and that's actually worked quite well. So I just want to commend Public Works and the Parks Department for their quick response to my request to pick up that waste from either illegal dumping or my effort with the landscaping. So I do appreciate that, even though it costs the taxpayer more that way. At least it's being done well and efficiently. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Mr. Portello. Thank you for calling in and for your comments. We made note of them. Madam Clerk, are there any other speakers?
Chair MacArthur, that actually concludes our speakers virtually or in person for this item.
Thank you. Given that, the next item on the agenda is the consent agenda. And the only item is the approval of the minutes for February 11th, 2025, Public Works and Transportation Committee meeting. Do any members have any questions or comments? If not, can we move to approve the minutes?
I'll move to approve the minutes as presented.
Okay. Madam Clerk, can we get a vote?
Committee Member Teran,
Yes.
Committee Member Basua, Chair MacArthur,
Yes,
and the motion carries 3-0. Thank you.
thank you. The next item on the agenda is item D1, Public Works, the subject maintenance and funding policy, workshop for landscape maintenance district. The recommendations of the Public Works and Transportation Committee. Number one, discuss key elements for a potential maintenance and funding policy for landscape maintenance districts. And two, recommend staff develop a maintenance and funding policy for landscape maintenance districts to be presented to the City Council for consideration. Michael Wolf is the contact on this one. Do any committee members have any questions of staff on this item before we get into potential public comment on this item? Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you, Mayor. And I want to thank staff for bringing this item forward for initial discussion. And I see there are members of the public here, and it seems that we have a couple comments waiting to go on that. So we'll get to those in just a moment. I'm just hoping that perhaps staff would be willing to frame the discussion here. And I'm wondering if members of the public had a chance to view the required pre-recorded video of this ahead of time. I see some head shakes. No? Well, because of Measure M, we are prohibited from showing you a live reenactment of that presentation tonight. So we're going to do our best to give you as much information verbally as we can. So I'm glad I asked if staff can just frame this discussion for us, and the folks who are here can get that baseline level info before we proceed.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Teran. Council members, this item is being brought up for discussion to really highlight and outline a potential policy for the management and operations of the city's landscape maintenance districts. Oh, so first things first, I'm sorry, my name is Anthony Miller. I'm the Special Districts Manager. I am the division manager for the division that manages all special financing districts in the city for landscape maintenance or otherwise. So to get into this from the very, very top, from the recommendation, this meeting here is to discuss potential maintenance and funding policy items that could potentially be brought to full council for formation into a policy for this topic. And in particular, this does not address any other district other than landscape maintenance districts. And I want to make that very, very clear that this does not address any district that is not a 1972 Act landscape maintenance district. So the city has a large number of these districts. We actually have 36 LMDs. And the city has had a pretty extensive history in managing these LMDs. And it has taken steps in the past to address some of the questions about LMDs and management and things like that that have come up previously. So in 2015-16, 2016-17, 2017-18, the city has taken some steps to address previous issues with LMDs. And this policy discussion is meant to help address potentially avoiding those problems in the future, or provide a staff a roadmap to deal with problems in the future regarding LMDs as well. I won't go through every single slide in the presentation. I know we're not supposed to be doing reenactments or anything like that, but I do want to bring the committee's attention particularly to the first attachment, which is a series of questions that staff have brought up, in that these are what we would call a policy level discussion. So something that may affect an LMD, that we would potentially have to answer one of these questions, but as a staff member, may not have the, this may encroach upon something that city council should be more than likely the one setting the policy or setting the directive for staff to follow. So those items, those 7 questions are not, by all means, they're not the only questions you can ask. These were just anticipated questions that commonly come up in the management of these districts. And how we are presenting this report is to be a form of a question and answer. If you would like to go through these questions one by one, we can do that. We have our special districts consultant on the line here to help provide any potential legal feedback that we might need to kind of have some perspective on when it comes to these districts. And also the items in here that are offered as example answers aren't necessarily the only answers that can be given, but are not necessarily direct suggestions, but are potential suggestions that staff might be able to follow if this was written into a policy. So that was a very, very high level, high overview of what the purpose of this policy is, or this proposed policy could be, is specifically for the management of 72 Act districts, and to touch on specific items that come up in the common management and operations of 72 Act districts. And I see Michael looks like he's about to say something. So,
All right, thank you for that high-level overview here. And just so that we're clear, we're not making any decisions tonight or sending anything to council as a result of this initially, right? This is just really the first conversation about this. Is that correct?
that is correct. You can send something to council from tonight if the committee chooses to do so. But what we are looking for from a staff perspective is we're looking for input from council as to how you would like to see this policy be written, or if whether or not we need one at all. From a staff standpoint, we would prefer a policy, but we don't want to box the city council in such a way that we are writing it for you. That is not our goal here.
And I think Mr. Wolf has an initial thing before my last question here.
Yeah, so the way we wrote the staff report and the recommendations, the second recommendation is for us to prepare a policy to go to council. So we could write a policy absent of input from the committee and bring it to council, but we felt like we wanted the community's input at this kind of meeting and the committee's input at this kind of meeting. We didn't want to write it in a vacuum. And so tonight we're looking for input, but we certainly, from a staff perspective, are ready to write a policy. We came up with these questions because Anthony's team manages these districts day to day. These questions come up daily, if not every hour of the day. And so he's ready to write this policy. But again, we didn't want to write it absent of input from the committee and the community. So we are actually seeking at the end of this meeting a recommendation from the committee that we prepare a draft to go to council.
Thank you for that. And this is just me speaking for myself on this. I would imagine, and my colleagues may agree or disagree, we have the public here tonight. We're here tonight to hear these items and give input, as well as what we hear from the public. My thought on that would be not to get too ahead of myself, but to send staff with direction on writing, and I'd hope to come back to committee for one more review before going to full council. But that's just me thinking out loud on that. So, although maybe we just are gangbusters tonight and we just knock it out and it's ready to go. But anyways, my last question, Mr. Miller, if you wouldn't mind, you mentioned the questions that were posed to the committee in the staff report in the first attachment. Just very quickly, would you mind just covering those handful of questions so that it might frame what is already being asked of the committee and the public tonight before we hear from the public speakers?
Sure. So these 7 questions are indicative of items that in specific situations could come up in the management of a 1972 Act district, that the city has leeway under the code on how we can approach this process. The city council can direct staff to follow a specific policy that would narrow this process down pretty substantially. So I'm just going to read the 7 questions off straight away, and that is: what position will the city take for underfunded districts that cannot afford to maintain their improvements? That is a very real possibility for some districts within the city. It happens all over the state. What is the process for addressing a district with a negative fund balance? That is something that the state code specifically speaks about, but doesn't exactly provide a specific remedy to address. There's multiple options that we could take. Should LMDs be required to meet a specific reserve fund balance target? Again, that's something that is specified in the state code that can be done, but there are multiple ways you can do it. Number 4 is who can request a district to be balloted. Districts and LMDs in specific, when we seek to make changes to an LMD, oftentimes this triggers a Prop 218 process. But who is asking whether or not those residents want to do that? That's going to be a question that we would seek to have some input on. And number 5 is what is the internal city process for approving new rates and who pays for that process? Essentially, Prop 218 leaves a lot of information up to the city to determine how that process is undertaken, who pays for it, and what goes into it. So for potentially approving new rates for an LMD, that question could potentially be answered through a policy. Number 6, should district subsidies be allowed or restricted? And if subsidies are allowed, should there be requirements for a district to meet prior to receiving them? In that case, that could be read as simply as should a district whose existence is to provide for its improvements that it was created with, should that district be subsidized by any other funding source for any purpose? Or it could be subsidy for its utilities, it could be a subsidy for its improvements in general. Should that be allowed to happen? And number 7 is what happens if a district is surveyed and chooses not to ballot themselves? That question is really directed towards districts that might be encountering funding difficulties or things along those lines. What are the follow-on consequences of not being able to maintain your improvements with the level of funding you have? And that is something that could be written into a policy.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Miller, and I think Mr. Wolf has something.
If you don't mind, so we wanted to provide those questions for the ability to have those interactions, but we didn't want this to be devoid of actually having some examples. And so the other attachments that are attached to the staff report are actual examples to what a policy could look like. So that way we're not just going back and forth on hypotheticals. There are some specific examples, and they're just examples. Attachments, I think, it's actually 2, 3, and 4
yes.
are some examples of what could be answers to those questions. Just want to make sure that that's clear of how we set this up.
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you for just not asking rhetorical, nebulous questions, but also giving potential examples of what this might look like in reality and practicality. All right, those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anthony. Councilwoman, Ms. Wu?
No, I just want to make a comment, not necessarily ask staff, but to my colleagues. I came prepared tonight to try to get this pushed forward to the council, make policy. I know we are tight on time, but if it's the desire of the committee and they're not ready to make those kinds of decisions, we can come back. I just don't want to get too much ahead without it going to council, and then council can bring it back one more time, and then we can move from there without getting everybody's opinion. But I'm ready tonight I would like to see a policy, and I'm prepared to give my opinion on what I would like to see on the policy. So just looking for both of you to either let me know, hey, you're getting ahead of yourself, or we want this to come back before I just start gabbing.
Okay. If there's no further comments, we'll just take some maybe public comment on this issue. We'll start with Ray, and then Ray, you're going to be followed by Imelda. Mr. Battelle.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Committee Chair, committee members, you want some public input? Here you go. So don't go too far without public input. We're paying for this. It is my understanding that most, if not all, areas covered by the LMDs are actually areas owned by the city. It is also my understanding of the law which governs LMDs that at the time of institution, 2/3 of homeowners must vote in agreement to establish the LMD. However, when the housing development is planned, there are no actual homeowners. The deal is struck between the city and the developer. The developer controls the vote for every future owner of the housing which are to be built. The actual homeowners have no say in this matter. The LMD is shoved down their throats without any say at all. Many don't even know the LMD exists since they're never examined the details of their property tax statements. Is this fair? Was it the intent of the law where it says 2/3 of the homeowners? Did it really mean the developer shall control all the votes? Wouldn't it be fair if, after all the properties within the development are sold and occupied by the actual homeowners, then and only then would a vote be taken relative to whether or not to form the LMD? Let the actual homeowners decide if they want to bear the burden of paying to maintain city-owned property. And again, perhaps another vote taken in 10 years following the initial vote, as by chance the ownership of the individual housings may have changed, along with individual attitudes and preferences. As it is, it's a win-win for the city and the developer. The city gets a transfer of the maintenance costs for certain areas of development to the homeowners. The developer doesn't care. After all, he won't be saddled with the ever-increasing maintenance cost. What harm does it do to him? As a matter of fact, it's probably a stipulation from the city that the developer institute the LMD or the development won't go through. It is part of the deal, a deal which does not involve the actual homeowners. So, can we make this fair as the intent of the law? Conduct a vote after the housing development is sold and occupied, not before the nail is even struck. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Platel. Ms. Garcia Ramirez?
Good evening, everyone. I agree with Ray. When I moved into my community or my house, I was told that once the whole tract was finished, I would know how much I would have to pay. So every year, it goes up and up and up. Where I live in right across from Camino del Sol. So I live on the corner of Rose and Camino del Sol. So up to a few years ago, our landscaping was maintained, both on the outside, because I'm right across from the park, so there's no house in front of my house. So when we park, there's an area on the inside of the street, our street, and then the outside, which that gets maintained yearly, all the time. Our side, on the inside, up to about maybe 6 years ago, they maintained it. I started sending emails, and I was told a year and a half ago that they were going to have a new contract with a new landscaping. So last year, maybe in April, it got done once. Then it got done a second time by inmates. They did a horrible job, but it got cut. My dad is 87 years old, and when he comes to visit, he goes, "Mija, it looks really ugly." So he'll go out there and cut the grass, the shrubs. Sometimes they're as high as me. It just looks really bad. And it's on a street where everybody can see how bad. People come and dump their trash because the shrubs are so tall. They just dump trash on the corner by the cul-de-sac at the end where they have the, when it rains a lot, the water goes there on that corner. And they used to maintain not the gates, but the rails. If they were bad, they would repair them. They don't even get repaired anymore. There's holes everywhere. But my concern is more the shrubs. It just looks really bad. And I was told it was going to get maintained now. It doesn't happen. Like, we have to go and cut it, because if we have to park on that side, there's just, you never know what's going to be in there. So that's my concern. But they do keep raising the fees every year. So, something has to be done about it, because once a year is not enough. They do maintain the outside, but not that inside. And they used to do everything at one time. So thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Madam Clerk, are there any others?
Mayor, we're going to move over to the virtual caller. So caller ending in 4018, please press *6. And you have 3 minutes starting now.
Yes, good evening again, Chair and Committee. This is Doug Portello again. Look, the landscape maintenance districts have been a complete disaster for the longest time. There's underfunded areas, there's areas that have large reserves, they're not well maintained. Now, back in 2016, there was an audit because it was such a mess, and part of that audit was kept secret concerning the administrative fees. That part of the audit needs to be made public, first of all. And then in terms of maintaining them, we paid $25,000 for NBS to train staff to take over the management, and we still have NBS and we have staff managing it. It shouldn't be both administrating the LMDs. What I recommend is that we dissolve all of the LMDs, because what we have is we have 36 or 37 areas that are covered under LMDs, and we have a large portion of Oxnard inside the neighborhoods, you know, the parkways and other areas that are not under an LMD. So is it fair that certain residents are paying for maintenance of city property and the city's not even maintaining it? The parkways, like in my neighborhood, in my street, the city doesn't touch them. I mean, because of the miracles of Measure E, they just finally started trimming the trees on the parkway. But they don't touch the parkways. Even Bert Perillo said, oh, no, that's the property owner. But that's not my property. That's city property, and the city needs to maintain it, whether it's under an LMD or whether it's not. Now, as far as the underfunded, well, put it back to the voters. Get a 2/3 vote, and if the voters want it, then they're going to pay for it. So put in a restricted inflator, not this ridiculous inflators. We did an audit of the LMDs, and we found a huge portion of the cost was under administrative costs, and it was ridiculous. I calculated 54% from the engineer's report, and it's actually higher, because what happened was that the city exceeded the limit for administrative fees and then hid that overage into the utilities line item. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's closer to 74%. If you look at the engineer's report, you will see these ridiculously high administrative fees, and we're not getting the service. We're not getting the maintenance. So it's not fair that some pay and some don't pay to maintain city property. You know, it said, well, it's special because you get the benefit of it. Well, some people get the benefit of it, and then the parks comes and they maintain it. When you squeak loud enough, they'll come and maintain it. It just needs to be eliminated and start over. Now, they did the illegal Renew Oxnard scheme to try to convert to Melrose, but Melrose is extremely unpopular. Even Pablo Perez from NBS said Melrose are very unpopular, and we rejected that. But at the same time, they rejected all the input from the community, myself included, as far as any volunteer efforts to help the city to maintain it, which I've done considerable effort to help maintain city property that was just let go to hell. So it's a mess, and it's still a mess. And the city can't quite get their act together to manage these assessment districts. So let's start over. Let's hit the reset button. And if people want it, great. If they don't, they shouldn't. But we shouldn't even have these LMDs. That's city property, and the city should be paying out of the general fund. Now, look, we got all that money from Measure E. We got all that money from Amazon. We got all this over $90 million a year extra coming in. So instead of increasing staff and giving these huge raises to certain staff, we should be putting that money into the actual services to maintain city property. I mean, it's just ridiculous that this just gets kicked down the road, on and on. I'm glad we're having this discussion. I think it's an important discussion. I wish more people were involved and informed about it instead of this certain narrative being set. Now, look, as far as the inflator.
Thank you,
and
Mr.
the
Portello.
administrative
Your
costs-
time is up.
Thanks, Mr. Portello. Yeah, thanks, Mr. Portello, for your comments. Madam Clerk, is there another virtual caller?
Mayor, that actually concludes our virtual speakers and in person.
Thank you. Anthony, just a quick question. Have we had a robust discussion with with, have we done surveys to get like real robust input from our community members as to what their thoughts are on this?
So our outreach primarily with our community members revolves around the operations of their LMD and their budget. This particular policy item isn't something that has been specifically brought up with community members. And it's not something that, like I said, it's not something that's actually fully written out right now for us to give them as an example as to what they might be able to discuss. So not at the moment, no.
But we did send out 6,000 notices, and we did advertise this on social media. So we've sent out the information about this meeting tonight. This was the intent of this meeting, is to draw the attention of the community to have input.
Correct.
Thank you. Councilwoman Bissell, were you going to say something?
Yes, I have some questions
Sure,
that
absolutely.
the speakers brought up that I'd like some clarification on. Mr. Patel said that the LMD's areas are owned by the city. Can the staff elaborate if that is true, not true?
So the LMDs maintain improvements. They are public property. They are owned by the city.
Okay.
But there are specific improvements within that property that they are the LMD's responsibility to maintain.
So if I may add to this, because we need to understand ownership and easements and right-of-way. So we have to be very careful about some of the words that we use here. Most of the time, the city does not own property. We're not the fee owner of property. We typically have easements over private property. So in the example that's provided, if you own a home, your property actually typically goes out to the center of the street. That is typically your property. We have a fee ownership we have an easement over the streets. And so when we talk about ownership, we have to be very careful about using that term. So the parkway that was discussed here, typically that parkway is owned in fee by the property owner. We have an easement for right-of-way purposes. So I just want to make sure we're clear on those terminologies here.
Okay, so I understand that terminology. I just want to make sure that the general public understands that what we have is an easement on a property that is owned by the owner it can be for numerous purposes, for utility purposes, for whatever purposes that the city might need to enter a property.
So, and again, I'm just using generalities. There are some places where we own streets in fee, we're the fee owners of the streets. So I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but usually cities do not own streets in fee.
Okay. Let's see. Another question by Mr. Patel was how development is set up with these LMDs. And, you know, as a homeowner, when you're going to buy something, they tell you. So that's, I'm not asking for an answer on that. But he said, what about doing an LMD after the fact? Is that something that staff can respond, or is that community development as far as, you know, when a development is brought forward?
So that's an entitlement process. That's not that's not part of the discussion tonight.
Right.
So as Anthony laid out, tonight is a discussion about existing LMDs. That comment is more about the development process and the entitlement process. I will say that the Streets and Highway Code section lays out the process by which districts are formed and changes are formed in the district. It's a code section, the state code section. I don't believe it says homeowners. Mark can probably nod his head yes or no. I think it says property owners. I don't think it says homeowners. As you mentioned, homeowners are required to have disclosures. They sign documents that say they read those disclosures. And so this idea that it's forced upon somebody, it's a choice that somebody makes to buy a home, it's a choice that somebody puts a signature on a disclosure. I mean, those are choices that folks make.
No, and I know, especially when I've purchased my homes before, I do get disclosures on easements. I have an easement specifically in my front yard that is SCE, and it's a huge box, and it's ugly, and You know, I bought the house knowing it was there and that they were gonna come onto my property. So, I mean, at least I've had, good real estate agents, I guess, escrow agents that have disclosed these documents to me. The other thing, and again, I don't know if staff is able to answer this question, might not be, is, we heard today from the speakers, why don't you just dissolve the 36 LMDs that are left? I understand it's a huge, and I'm not saying that's gonna happen or that I want that to happen, but there is a fiscal impact to that. And I don't know if staff is able to speak about the fiscal impact to the general fund today.
That is a great question, and I think it really depends upon how you want to measure the impact on the general fund by how those areas are maintained. And so the areas, it's very difficult to say, if you dissolve all the LMDs, you're gonna have X number of dollars immediately impact the general fund. That isn't exactly what would happen. There would be an impact on the general fund. There absolutely would be an impact on whatever funding source was used to maintain those LMDs. But there's a lot of, each LMD is an entity. You can't dissolve them as a group. You have to dissolve them individually, and you have to make decisions upon those things individually. There are lots of items that have to deal with whether or not there's an HOA present, or whether or not, how well the property is maintained, and how well this, the funding source would maintain it. Rough order of magnitude, and I'm going to say this and hopefully not get quoted on this later, but I would say that you would be looking at $3 to $4 million in landscaping expenses alone for the LMDs. But there are potentially other costs that come with that.
Right, and that all depends on the level of service if we were to dissolve these LMDs. So for example, I don't live in an LMD, and I can tell you that my area around me does not get the kind of quality service that these LMDs or Seabridge or other very nice prestige areas in our city. I don't have that type of landscape in my area. So I can really speak about how these special districts, can impact the community if they're taken on by the general fund. And I am not suggesting that tonight, but I just want to make sure that at least we get some answers to some of those questions that we had from our community members.
No problem.
Council member? Mark Mandel, the city's legal consultant on these. I think one thing to look at is the way that we're framing these districts. The reason these districts exist and the reason they get formed in general while the developer is developing is because the developers are wanting to put in extensive landscaping. And the city, once it's built and once it's dedicated to the city, there's no one really else to maintain it except for the city. So the city is so at the point where the subdivision is being designed, there's a choice being made of what sort of landscaping to put in on the public right of way. And is the city willing to take on the maintenance of that? And one of the reasons why the city is willing to take on the maintenance of extensive improvements in new and kind of fancy subdivisions is because an LMD gets created in order to defray that cost. And if you were to choose whether or not to have an LMD after the development is already created, the landscaping is already there. So there's no way to balance that. Should we have this fancy landscaping versus, okay, who's going to pay for it? Because the landscaping is already there and is already dedicated to the city. So that's part of the rationale for why these are created during the development process, rather than once everything is in place and dedicated.
Thank you, I appreciate that answer.
Thank you.
If I can just add a few comments, because this is a pretty significant public policy question, and it's one of these issues where on the dais, you have to have one eye zoom in on the problem on the ground, but then you have to have one eye with a wide lens about public policy of the general fund for the entire city. So the reason these tools, initially the LMDs from the 1972 rulemaking and thereafter Melrose were put in place and employed by cities is in large part due to Prop 13 and some regulations after that restrict any city's revenue. So as cities grow, this is the tool of choice, or in some cases, you could argue of necessity. So these, and it's been mentioned before, these are put in place, agreed upon, and then you go forward. So this idea in the future of dissolving it or undoing it, in the big picture, is a grand bait and switch on the general fund. So whether it's the old LMDs or the newest CFDs, like River Park and Wagon Wheel, these agreements are made to build and create neighborhoods of a certain aesthetic value. Now, part of the zooming in on the problem on the ground is some of these original LMDs unfortunately lacked foresight. They are still budgeted as the gasoline price from 1972 or 1980. They were still budgeted for the people who cut the grass and trimmed the trees of their costs from 1972 or 1980 and what have you. So that's why they're underfunded. They're frozen in time. It's impossible just to buy gas for a lawnmower at those prices. So that's part of the why the staff is raising these broader policy questions. But I want to be very clear, in prioritizing the broad general fund, this is not a strictly public safety priority, right? And I think it is unfair. I think it would be unfair for the rest of the taxpayers who don't live in these special districts to now flip the bill. Now, going forward, you could have a policy that we don't want to entertain LMDs and CFDs and other Ds and whatever have you districts. You could take that kind of a policy so that we don't set this up for another city council 25 years from now. Right, because it can't be that the homeowners are complaining now, because I have to disagree with Mr. Blattel. No one's forcing anyone to purchase these properties. I'm sorry, but that's a fact. So again, broad public policy. We're having this discussion to try to figure a path forward that is pragmatic and works. But we also need to balance out what's the fairness of the general fund for all the property owners that are not in these special districts. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. Just to follow up on Mr. Bertello's, he made a comment that one of the recent audits that was done indicated that a majority of monies went to just the maintenance versus the actual work being performed. Is there some validity to that assertion that he made?
I believe he's making an assertion regarding the process in 2015 and 16, and I was not here at the time, and I do not understand where that assertion is coming from, so I really can't speak to it.
Sure. And I'm sorry, Councilwoman Basu, did you have any other, I didn't mean to cut you off. Do you have any other comments or questions?
No, I'm just.
Okay, good. Mayor Pro Tem.
If I can, perhaps this is expanding on the mayor's question here regarding the administrative costs as outlined or gleaned from the engineer's report, where I have in my notes 54% plus possibly more of the cost to the LMDs, according to the engineer's report, were for administrative costs. I don't have the engineer's report in front of me here, but I would imagine, it wasn't clear in the comment if that was overall, all 36 LMDs, calculated out, all aggregated, that 54% of costs went to administrative costs, or if it's something like LMD 11 that brings in, only 5 figures or so for the year for all of those homes, and a smaller number, I would imagine administrative costs would be a larger proportion of that. Or do you proportion it smaller for those small LMDs? So maybe if we can get some clarification on that. Is that close to what you were wondering too, Mayor?
Exactly.
So the way we do it, I would say the way we currently do it is outlined in the engineer's report, which is a consolidated report for all LMDs within the city. The administrative costs are proportioned amongst those LMDs by a direct comparison with its other LMDs of their budgeted maintenance expenses. And we define that as what is a direct expense. So basically the contractor costs that go into that district and other direct expenses that could be billed to that district, excluding utilities. So that is a very short description of that. I do want to say that those kinds of questions, while absolutely pertinent and relevant to LMDs, I do believe they take us a slightly off topic of what this policy discussion is actually directed towards, and that's the maintenance and operation of current LMDs rather than the overall fairness of them or their creation going forward. In fact, I believe the city manager brought up something really, really important in that the development process, we can specify if you don't want LMDs, that's absolutely something that can be done, but that's not something that's addressed in these questions.
But maybe to answer your question, the smaller LMDs, obviously, when they don't have a lot of direct maintenance costs, there's still a component of the administrative cost that they have to burden, right? And so that administrative cost is not just Anthony's team. We as a Public Works and Anthony as a special districts get charged for IT and things like that. So to your question, there is a component that is affected by the size of the LMD comparisons to some of the larger LMDs. But for Anthony's purposes, for Anthony's overhead costs, his administrative costs for his staff, it's based on the size of the LMD itself.
Okay, thank you for that.
Sorry, I would say even furthermore is that there are different, I would say, even classifications of administrative costs to that point, in that some are incurred directly by those districts proportionally, and then others are incurred flatly based on what service is being performed.
Sure, thank you. And I would make the comment that even discussing the administrative costs and the points raised by a couple of the speakers certainly have some relevancy to what we have here, but I see what you're saying, Mr. Miller, about we want to focus specifically on the policy and what we're going to do with kind of these most common questions or concerns that come up about LMDs. So if I can, kind of bring us back squarely on that, I'm wondering if we can start with a framework of the 7 questions you presented there and have a discussion on each one, keeping in mind of time that technically we have about less than 45 minutes left in this committee. And I see Mayor, Councilwoman Sue is there. I'm happy to turn it over to her if you'd like.
Go ahead.
I just have a question before we enter the questions. Of the 36 LMDs, how many are in a negative balance?
So none of excuse me, I take that back. One LMD is dealing with a negative fund balance. There are 11 LMDs that deal with capped rate increases. They cannot raise the rates further than where they are now without a Prop 218 process.
Okay, 11 of them.
11 currently,
Okay.
yes. And there are 22 LMDs with capped rates for utilities.
Okay, but currently we just have one right now that
Correct.
is looking at a negative balance.
Yes.
Okay, and of the 36, well, I guess we haven't had any outreach. I'm just wondering if the residents within these 36 want the exact same service they're getting now or feel that they need additional services. I guess that hasn't been done, correct?
So that's something that my team attempts to gauge during our quarterly discussions, where I would admit we would love to see more people involved in these meetings. We don't have a great turnout, but we also receive comment and questions and concerns during the year, throughout the year at our office. Anyone is welcome to call our office and discuss those items, and that is how we, oftentimes it's how we gauge public interest too, is how, what kind of communication we're receiving. So in a case where our larger, let's say we have a larger LMD where we have something that, a new contract per se that's coming up that might incur, a change in expenses for the district, that might trigger my staff to go reach out to that LMD in particular. Now, we're in the middle of a contract, so that hasn't happened in some time. So I would say our expenses are relatively consistent. But we like I said, we also receive 311s, communication, that items to like kind of guide where we want to budget and put draw our attention toward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn it back over to you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Yes, so if we can go back and I'll go out on a limb here. I sent a request over to Diego in the back. We have just a quick visual reminder for the public on these questions that were posed in the staff report, if you wouldn't mind putting those up. Give him just a moment on that. And I just want it to be on the record what the questions were. If folks are watching this on YouTube or on their phones, they can pause it to see that. There they are. And so I'll just say, as we go through this, as you mentioned earlier, Mr. Miller, these are questions that are being posed by staff for discussion to just kind of stimulate the ideas and the processing here of, okay, what are we going to do about these most common things that come up here? And what's some policy discussion around this? So maybe we could just start at the top of the first one. What position will the city take for underfunded districts that cannot afford to maintain their improvements? Thank you, Diego. So on this one, I know we have some examples that are shared here of policy concepts. So these are things, it says the cost to provide services exceeds the maximum rate. So examples are reserves may be used to fund the shortfall, like these are possible items, right? Reduce the routine services, reduce expenses. A maximum levy may be applied. Conduct outreach to determine interest in pursuing a Prop 218 ballot process. Eliminating the improvements altogether, or other council direction. So those are just ideas. It's not an exhaustive list, but Mr. Miller, given where our LMDs are today in the city of Oxnard, we have 1 in negative balance and 11 capped, as you had mentioned, and then 22 capped for utilities. As it pertains to question 1, open to thoughts on that based on what we've heard from the public, based on our comments here, from anyone on staff on what has been done by other cities or what might be a best practice in such a situation, or a number of practices.
So in currently what we do as staff, as just a matter of current direction, and we use reserves where available to fund a shortfall if it's legally allowable. And routine services, typically the first 2 bullets are the first items that come up for discussion first. The easiest one for us, the easiest lever for us to pull is to reduce services, because that reduces expenses directly. It's not the most ideal situation, and I would say actually an example from one of the public speakers tonight is that was a district that was impacted by an increase in cost of services. We weren't able to continue services at the same rate that was previously done. And then depending upon if the district is at its maximum levy amount, we have the option, the ability to change its levy amount to meet what we expect the expenses to be. So that is something that we can do, and we are currently doing at a certain number of districts that have expenses that require a maximum levy. We don't apply a maximum levy across all districts, and it's not a universal determination that we would do that. It's based on each district's expenses and each district's needs. The items that we don't currently, or we haven't really undertaken, and that's the Proposition 218 question. That is particularly relevant for districts that have capped inflator or capped rates. We don't have the option to do anything else other than use reserves or other than reduce your service levels, because we cannot raise rates any more than they currently are. And then eliminating improvements is something that the City Council has actually done in the past, particularly in 15, 16, and 16, and 17. We removed things that were considered general benefit from districts so that their overall responsibility was lessened. So that has been done in the past, but what we would not recommend that happen is to our district, we wouldn't remove what would be considered an area of specific or special benefit to the community. So something within a community, say a traffic circle that really only serves a specific area within a community, we wouldn't recommend that would be removed.
And the part of your question was maybe other experiences that we've had at other agencies. And so I will say that this is not unique to Oxnard. I've worked at, this is my 4th agency I've worked for, and 2 of the other 3 agencies I've worked for, this is a very similar conversation that I've had to have with city council members. And those exact examples were were policies and procedures that we put in place in those other agencies. And so all of those are similar processes or procedures that I've seen in 2 previous agencies that I worked for when we were putting together policy. So hopefully that answers that second part of your question.
It does, thank you. And I think one of these bullet points blends into question 3 about should LMDs be required to meet a specific reserve fund balance target. And looking at that, where if we're saying reserves may be used to fund a shortfall, I know there's a question I had of staff ahead of the meeting. When we look at reserves, when we have an example that you gave where the assessments that are happening for folks in particular LMDs are being far outpaced by the increased costs of labor and materials and inflation and what have you, how do we glean reserves from folks who are already getting reduction in services or reduction in what they're seeing for their dollar because their dollar is not being stretched as fast as the increased cost of those services can go? How do we, what's the mechanism for that for reserves?
So that's a great question. It's actually a really technical question as well. We have an internal goal of 47.4% that we use. And now the reason why we choose that goal is because explicitly defined within the Streets and Highways Code, there is the allowance for the maintenance of a reserve that is up until the first property tax disbursement that is done during the year, which in our case is approximately 47.4% of the year. The goal for that reserve balance is to provide a positive cash flow for a fund during the fiscal year. So that way you're not drawing a fund negative until your first property tax payment comes in. Now, if an LMD doesn't have that reserve, right now there is no policy within the city that says we can't draw that fund negative from a cash flow standpoint. And we do that for a few LMDs. There aren't too many, but there are some that do incur that. But what that does is it effectively allows a transitory negative cash balance within that district's fund. So if you were to say, recommend that we require a reserve balance, that would be a very rigid requirement. And we would likely have to take other extraordinary measures to lower costs in our budget just to meet a reserve fund that we wouldn't necessarily be touching except for in a case of emergency.
And if you remember the council's policy for reserves on your operating side of the house, it's the language is endeavor to, so it's not a mandatory requirement. There's some wiggle room there. So.
All right, thank you for that. Yeah. And I see the overlap of those 2 items, but I also see the challenges we might face with that in boxing ourselves or property owners being boxed in something like that too. And just for the public, and this is kind of what popped into my head when you were sharing about, we have reserves that we utilize prior to the disbursement of the property tax. I've worked in education a long time. I used to be an 11-month employee where there was 1 month out of the year, it was typically July, that I would have the month off, but I also did not get a paycheck that month. And so I had, before they had equalization in my previous employer where they could spread out your check, and you'd get a check that 12th month, but it'd be the same as all the others. Before that, it was on you to just figure it out. And so I had a special savings account that was called July Savings, and I'd put a little in there each month. So that way that month that I had no income, that was how I paid my bills and, did some other things and was able to survive for a month without a paycheck. And I look at it as my way of not having a negative fund balance, not relying on credit cards and all this stuff. So I'm trying to just think of a practical example here, and that's what came to me. Maybe I'm not hitting the mark on that, but it was a savings that I had because I knew there was going to be a time when I had the money, but I needed to be able to actually have the money to pay for what I needed to do to survive. So anyways, just hoping that analogy or that metaphor lands for people is that there's a savings to pay for things when the money's not there, but it will be there, right? So anyhow, so for this first one, what position will the city take for underfunded districts that cannot afford to maintain their improvements? I've kind of maximized my thoughts on that and input from staff. I'll turn it back to the mayor.
I think Councilwoman Bissell had something.
Do you want to speak first?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
So first of all, as we go through these questions, I would like to see in the policy that staff is always going to be doing a 5 to 7 year outlook for these LMDs. That's one thing I would like to see in this policy. That way, homeowners, and I'm also going to ask for outreach once a year to the LMDs where the property owners get a outlook of what their LMDs is going to look like. I think that's the first thing that I want to see in this policy. With that being said, it says what positions does the city take to underfund these districts. As far as reserves, I have a different outlook on this because I don't want homeowners paying more than they need to, because what if they sell their home? Then they just added money to this reserve that they're not going to take a benefit from. So I'm kind of putting on my homeowner hat and thinking I want staff to try to do such a good job that there'll be a little bit of money left over, but it's not going to come out of, the homeowners. So that's where my 5 to 7 year lookout is. I'd like to see very minimal reserves if we do have any. So that's my suggestion in regards to the reserves. If we do fall into, hey, there's no more money, I would like to see a community outreach, 2, reduction of routine services and expenses, with the goal to go out for and pursue the Proposition 218 ballot. Within that order, because it's going to take us time to get to the 218. So while we do that, I want to make sure that we are doing everything we can in order to reduce the services. But I'm really hoping that with a 5 to 7 year lookout, we won't have to get to that point. And I won't jump to 2. I'll wait.
Sure. Yeah. One thing I have, Anthony, is I think more effort needs to be put in place to do a robust outreach to those affected for the LMDs. Whether it be through like neighborhood councils, whether it be through surveys, just so that they're informed about this policy consideration. Those are just my thoughts.
Oh, one more thing to add to that.
Absolutely, go ahead.
As we're doing this, part of it, I think, we also need to examine the average of the property values to the LMDs. So, so basically, how much is everybody being assessed the same? So if that makes any sense.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask for clarification. So if you can maybe clarify what you're asking?
So part of when we get into a deficit, we should do this now, I think. We should really start looking at, you're saying we're not getting enough money for all these LMDs. So we should look at the average of each LMD, or do we have that already?
So we got to. I would hesitate to put averages on LMDs, because you may have an LMD that has 200 homes with 1,000 square foot of landscaping, and another LMD that has 2,000 homes with 10 square foot of landscaping. And so there's not an average LMD and not an average amount of assessment, because none of them look the same. They're done by equivalent benefit units, and they're done by the square footages. So each LMD is, the special benefit and the analysis is done is specific to that LMD based on the number of EBUs and based on the amount of improvement. So the fact that one LMD charges $500 a year and one charges $50 a year is because of those specific improvements and the amount of properties and EBUs in them.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Mayor Protem.
I want to go back to something just so we're clear on the reserves. So we have sort of two components to the reserves. So there is an operational component, and I can appreciate the comment about trying to keep that to a minimum. But there is an allowance in the Streets and Highway Code section that talks about improvements that or collecting funds for improvements that cannot be done in any 1 year. So you can think of these as capital projects, exactly. And so is your comment more specifically to the operating reserves?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So that's where my comment is, to the operating. Obviously, if you know you have capital coming, I would want that also on the yearly report and letting the homeowners know this is what we're going to be saving for in order to do it in year 10, whatever it is.
And the Streets and Highway Code section requires us to actually do that, so yes.
Yes, and actually, one more item on that, we can't actually, so the Streets and Highways Code limits us to 5 years for certain specific items, and then for items that might take longer than that, there's actually the ability to set a schedule up for it, or potentially put into an agreement with that district, with the city, to have the general fund cover it, and then the district pay it off over time.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem, go ahead.
Thank you. Councilwoman Basua mentioned the Proposition 218 process, and we've mentioned that as well already in this discussion. And I'm hoping, because it's going to blend into, as we go through the rest of this discussion here, for any folks in the public who may not be aware or only peripherally aware, can we give just a very high level, just, 30-second version of what the Proposition 218 process is? Because we'd have a potential, I'm guessing, of 36 individual processes for this. Is that right?
It potentially, yes. And more than likely, this would only really affect those districts that have capped rates. Mm-hmm. But I actually think I'll turn that one over to Mr. Mandel. He's probably much more qualified to answer that than I am.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, the Proposition 218 process would be something you would do if you were going to need to or want to increase a rate above the maximum rate. And the way it works is the city mails a notice and a ballot to each property owner in the district, giving them information about the proposed increase to the max rate, and and then there's a ballot where they have the opportunity to mail it in, either yes or no. And in order for the council to move forward and approve the increase, the number of yes votes need to exceed the number of no votes. And the votes are weighted by the dollar amount of the assessment against the parcel. So a parcel that has a $500 assessment has twice as much vote as one that has $250 assessment.
Thank you for that. Yeah, much appreciated. Just so that folks have that context, as that term will likely come up throughout the rest of this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Mayor, Chair McCarthy, we actually have a virtual speaker. If we can take that speaker
you can take
now.
it now. Sure.
Thank you. Caller ending in 2382, press *6 to unmute, and you have 3 minutes starting now.
Hi, thank you for letting me speak. This is Debbie Mitchell from Mandalay. We're that underfunded district. And one of the things that I'm hearing sort of missing about what's going on with our district is we've been trying to get our assessment raised actively since 2006 and ran into a number of problems and are closer than we have ever been. However, currently we have a project, the Hemlock Project, that is sending us into a deficit. We know we will owe part of that back. This came up kind of as a result of the 50-50 split with our district and the city. In the number of years that we've been trying to increase our assessment, we ran into a number of roadblocks. And as that has happened, what we have come to find out, which I haven't heard discussed here, is in addition to the ballot measure, we need to have engineering documents that explain exactly what the bonds would be spent for. And our current roadblock is that there is a permit that has been sitting at the Water Board since October of 2023 for a project that was fully approved in 2018 by the Water Board, the Coastal Commission and the Army Corps of Engineers for a project on Hemlock to do an R&D project to see what process would be most effective that would actually impact 40% of the 7.5 miles of seawall in the known repairs and replacements that need to be done. And until we finish the Hemlock project, and then it will take about a year to study the impact of that, we can't go for a bond because we won't have the necessary engineering documents. Once we have the engineering documents for that, that our homeowners are well aware of the need to increase our assessment. Anyone who is currently paying $500 could pay up to $3,000. And that's just an average. Our assessments are based on linear foot of seawalls, and that varies from property to property. But we have fully promoted that. We've been aware of it and been having annual meetings every year where that is clearly explained and ongoing meetings where people understand. Every homeowner that buys a home is informed. And the city has been very forthcoming in our budget meetings. Our problems with our budget meetings are things like health and safety.
Yeah.
In trimming back what's spent out of our
Thank
assessment.
you, ma'am. Your time is up. Thank you for that comment. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. Just to round out this part, and I have some overlap with what Councilwoman Basua mentioned. If there are reserves for an LMD, I would certainly want to defer to those if we can, followed by reducing routine services and expenses. And again, outreach to residents, understanding what that means and what that looks like and why that's happening. And then, reminding them at regular intervals that if it would serve them well to consider if they'd like to reassess themselves or increase that rate, as was explained by Mr. Mendel, the Prop 218 process, and not having them feel like they have to do it, but letting them know this is another option that you have to have us avoid these constantly tapping into reserves, having to reduce routine services and expenses, because that's just going to be, it seems to me, an ongoing Sisyphean effort, right, with the boulder, right? So anyways, those are my thoughts on the first item here, and I think we've overlapped with a couple other items there, like the number 3 for the reserves, right?
So for number 2, if I may, it says, what is the process for addressing a district with a negative fund balance? Staff can definitely, obviously, reduce in expenses. Council can choose to allow this through approving an engineer's report showing an insufficient reserve balance, as the negative balance will be temporary. I'm not opposed to that. I just want to define temporary.
So temporary would mean until the first property tax assessments are received.
Okay, so I think I'm not opposed to that at all. I just want to put that language instead of temporary until the next assessment is received.
And I want to make very special note that that is for the cash flow section of this,
Right.
and not the end of year balance, because those are two different things under the scope of the law.
Okay, and then for the end year, again, staff can require reduced expenses, absolutely. A maximum levy may be applied. General fund subsidy loan. I don't want to do the general fund. That's how we get into big messes. I think it's, people are thinking, okay, we have a healthy general fund right now, but it's not about right now. It's what we look at 10 years down the road, what I'm concerned about. So a lot of cities, a lot of councils get into problems because, oh, wow, we've had Amazon come in and we've got all this funds. We do not know if that is sustainable. We do not know what the state is going to do with our taxes. So my thought process has always been, I'm not looking at now, I'm looking what the city looks like 10 years down the road. So I'm opposed to subsidizing anything with the general fund.
Yeah, you're good, Mayor Pro Tem.
And thank you, Councilwoman, and thank you, Mayor, for the floor. I'll second, just in concept, what the Councilwoman has brought up. When it comes to negative fund balance, cash flow, everything that was mentioned for end of year, where it looks like we have an LMD that is ending the year in the red and may perpetually do so, more so year after year after year with an ever-growing negative fund balance. I think that's where we have to really work with residents on understanding that situation and why it is and what their options are. The only thing that, or not the only thing, but one thing I want to reiterate and also just share my portion of what Councilwoman Basua has brought up. The general fund, I also would be opposed to subsidizing LMDs for continued operations if they hit a negative fund balance at the end of the year. And my reasoning for this, it was mentioned earlier, I'm looking right now at a map from the presentation that we can't show tonight. And I note that in districts 5 and 6 especially, they're, with very small exceptions, pretty much devoid of LMDs. In District 2 that I represent, I certainly have the large CFD5 and I have CFD7 for wagon wheel. I have 2 small LMDs, but otherwise the Orchard Park, Sierra Linda, Carriage Square, Fremont North, Fremont South neighborhoods, all of those would essentially be subsidizing the LMDs. And in addition to all the neighborhoods that encompass the ones I mentioned for districts 5 and 6. And when we talk about equity, we already have a lot of needs and challenges in those other neighborhoods throughout the city. I don't see that as equitable to have them subsidize something that was agreed upon many years ago, but the LMD should be self-sustaining. So that's my views on that.
And Anthony, just to be clear, with the general fund subsidy we're talking about, I mean, I'm not opposed to keeping it as an option myself. I mean, given it's very minimal, you're talking, because you mentioned it's only one LMD, right, that has a negative balance out of the 36?
Currently, we have one LMD with a negative fund balance, correct?
Right, but that would be like a last option. You can always look at reducing expenses or maximizing, or setting like a levy at a maximum rate before we even considered a subsidy, right? That's just maybe
Correct.
a last resort or something.
And that is the purpose of this meeting tonight, is to
Right.
kind of have that discussion.
Right,
So.
yeah, I'm not necessarily opposed to just, should, I mean, it's so minimal, I mean, you got 1 out of 36. Just foreseeably, like, if something were to come up, I necessarily wouldn't be opposed to a subsidy or a loan. I would imagine it's probably minimal, given that it's 1 out of 36.
I cannot support that, and the only reason is because, A, we do it for one, we do it for all. So it would defeat the purpose of staff going out and letting LMDs know, hey, we're a deficit, who cares? Your policy says you're going to fund us. So I don't want to get into that rabbit hole of we do it for one, we're going to do it for all, and I don't want to put staff in that predicament where now they're stuck because it's just a rabbit hole. So as much as I would love to, I can't support that, so.
Yeah, and I will say that the language used is very important here. And I think what Mayor MacArthur is saying, and that you may be able to do this, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a requirement. So that can be something that you put that nuance into a document, but I would say that would be a direction item.
Correct. Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. And I would counter to that with, in 2025, we have one in a negative balance, but in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, I mean, what's the oldest LMD we have in the city? Do we know that off the top of our head?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just ballpark?
45 years old.
Okay, and what's the newest one?
Probably about 22 years old.
Okay, so we have a wide range here, but these LMDs have been existing for a couple of decades. And a decade from now, what does this look like? And I'm glad we're doing this policy discussion so that we can avoid these situations, but it is a policy discussion. And while we have one today, what if we have another one in the next ensuing 5 years? What do we have 10 years from now? What do we have 15 of the 36, in 2032? I mean, it's just something that, as Councilwoman Basua put it, it is a rabbit hole where we can certainly put may as the language. I feel a little bit better about that, but I also don't want it to be an expectation that that's something we're going to do. And again, it comes back to equity for me, where we have neighborhoods that are 60, 70 years old who there were never LMDs even on the books or an option when they were developed. And I just don't feel comfortable asking those historical neighborhoods or legacy neighborhoods to step in to subsidize something that should be a self-sustaining mechanism.
Michael, you want to say something?
I just want to add, I think Anthony mentioned at the very beginning, we have 11 districts that don't have an inflator.
Correct.
So if you think about that, there's a potential for those 11 districts at some point in time in the future with what we know to be inflation to potentially have the potential to be a negative fund balance at some point in time. And I've seen that at other places where the inflation just catches up to those districts. And these are districts that were, as the city manager mentioned, were estimated in the 80s or 90s when things cost a different, they were just different costs. And without an actual inflator, the expectation that those costs stay the same for 50, 60, 70 years, I don't think is a realistic expectation. And so there's 11 districts that don't have an inflator, so there's a potential for those 11 districts over the next 5, 10, 15 years to potentially have a negative fund balance.
Thank you for that. And imagine if these LMDs had to buy eggs, where they'd be gone.
Makes sense, yeah. Yeah, Lux.
Only 1 dozen per shopper at Trader Joe's. It isn't just about at what point will they go into the negative. It's also about the quality of the service that they receive in the meantime. So it's not just about going negative, it's about not having enough to have the frequency or the quality of the service that you want to match your other neighbors.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Can we,
I'm sorry.
no, if we can go to 3.
Okay. Number 3? Okay.
I was just gonna suggest, I feel that we've touched on 3 already from number 1, where it had a bullet point around reserves. Is there anything else folks have on that?
Well, I think 47.4 is too much. I mean, I don't know how you feel about reserves. I said what I said, but I'm not opposed to having 5, 10%. I mean, I'm not opposed to it, just 47 is a lot.
I'm wondering if, what would staff's opinion be on policy where, I don't want to say case-by-case basis, but proportionally, depending on the size of the LMD and where they are fiscally, do we have to put a hard 47.4? I understand the logic and the reasoning behind it, as Mr. Miller brought out earlier, but is that realistic for across-the-board policy?
It makes budgeting for certain LMDs very difficult at the 47.4% level. I would say that it significantly impacts the capped districts, but I believe Mr. Mandel might have a comment as well on this. Maybe I misunderstood. I thought he had his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, was there something you were asking me to address?
No, I'm sorry, I apologize. I thought you raised your hand for a second. The 47.4% number could potentially put a more difficult budget discussion on the LMDs that are capped. And part of the reason for that is because if that becomes a requirement, it effectively forces us to have that cash flow or cash balance on hand prior to budgeting for any other expenses. And that would potentially significantly limit the actual services we could provide. So that actually speaks a little bit more to what the city manager was referring to in terms of quality of service.
Sure, and maybe we can remind the public what the city council's policy is on our reserves.
I think it's 10.
16? So 16% and 25 utilities. I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr. Wolf.
No, you heard it, so go ahead. 16.6 for
16.6.
for general fund and 25 for utilities. So I want to state that the Streets and Highway Code section, as Anthony said, doesn't actually specifically give a percentage. It gives information that allows us to calculate a percentage, and it's not a mandatory. Some people read that as it gives you, that's the maximum that you can have, and so that's why we wrote it this way. And to Anthony's point, it makes it very difficult for his team to budget when it's set as a requirement, and so if there was a direction from the committee to have something less than 47%, that's certainly okay with us.
Would it be possible to set this at a reasonable thing that works, that would work across the board? I don't know, 12%, 15%, 10%, whatever that might be. But then residents have the option to say, well, we would like our reserve to be this, you know, and that would be a LMD resident discussion with special districts. Is that a possibility?
I think that gets, I would say, pretty far into the weeds in terms of how an LMD actually functions. And it doesn't really have a direct impact on an actual operational standpoint until it becomes a higher number. So if a resident, say, requests that they want 100% of reserves, what Mr. Wolf said comes into play here as well, is that there are some opinions that might not be a legal thing to do, that we may not even be able to entertain that request.
How would the committee members entertain a reserve not to exceed 20%?
I think that language would provide a lot of flexibility, and
so
it would
not to
provide a
exceed.
ceiling.
So we're talking, again, operating reserve.
Operating reserve not to exceed 20%. So the city cannot keep more than 20%.
Mr. Wolf, what do other cities, given your experience working for other cities, have? Is this?
So the other two cities where we put a policy together, I don't recall us setting a reserve requirement. And Mark, do you remember in Moreno Valley, was there an actual setting of the reserve requirements?
You know, I don't recall. I think in general of setting the policy, it's important to state both a cap and also a goal. So if you're going to use a 20% or a 30%, state it shouldn't, the reserve shouldn't exceed that, but also, is the goal to have reserves that are that high? Because I think you have some districts right now which are below your reserve goal, where you're trying to get the reserves up, but it's going to take time to build up those reserves without going above your maximum rate for the district.
So the answer is, I don't recall us setting a goal, but I just want to make sure we understand kind of the reasons why we have this. It's just similar to why we have an operating reserve for goal for the general fund. Is if something comes up in the middle of the year and we want to be able to address that. I mean, these are obvious reasons. So having a reserve helps with that. Councilwoman Basua's point of, these are people that may sell their homes in the middle of that process, and so that's a sensitive issue in terms of them paying into that reserves and not really potentially getting that money back. And so I think a fair direction, and we could put this in the policy, is a sort of a goal of a maximum of 20%. I think that's something we could put into the policy, and that would be a goal that we would set. And so for those districts that can make that, I think some of them can make it relatively easy. For those that can't make it, then that obviously is a goal that for us to strive for going forward.
And I will say there is a follow-up question to this, and that is, if a district can fund its operations but does not yet has not yet reached that goal, is the direction then to staff to change the rate to address that need? Should we raise the rate specifically to meet that reserve balance? And I think that's a follow-up question as well.
So I don't want to raise the rate. I think we need to work within our service levels in order to try to get some reserves in. I don't want this to, it's going to be an impact. I understand. I just don't want to add to that impact.
Yeah. Okay.
Should we move on to
Yeah.
number 4 here?
I think we're good on 3. Yeah, we can move on to number 4. Who can request the district to be balloted?
If I may.
Yeah, go ahead, Mayor Protem.
Thank you. I think the example policy concept brought up in here is perfectly acceptable and makes logical sense. The affected property owners, a property owner should be the one who can request the district to be balloted.
I agree.
I'm good with that, yeah.
Okay. That was easy.
Yeah, number 5, any issues with 5? What is the internal city process for approving new rates and who pays for the process? There's various examples on here. Yeah,
Is city staff able to tell me how much would the Prop 218 cost? Because I'm going to assume that these districts will have no money in order to do that. So this is the one time that I would say yes to the general fund, because it's going to make, it makes sense in order to fund the districts.
That's a that's a great question. So it depends on the size of the district, but rough cost would approximately be about $10,000 to $12,000.
Okay, so I would like on this one that the general fund pays for the process. Only time.
Now, if I'm going to add here on as well, a lot of these bullets also establish what level of interest you embark upon that process, and that's a very important question to ask, because regardless if the ballot measure succeeds, the bills still do.
And if I may, and maybe Mr. Wolf can share if he has experience of this in other jurisdictions, or your experience, Mr. Howlett and Mr. Miller. If a ballot fails, it says here, if a ballot fails, the city may incur the cost of the ballot. Services must be reduced to meet the district financial capacity, because the voters, the property owners, have said no to the increase, right? Future ballots may not be considered by the city council for a period of time unless unforeseen circumstances are observed. And that's a big part for me is, again, I made my statement about the general fund, and I agree with what Councilwoman Basua says here, just given typical circumstances where property owners say, okay, fine, let's bring this to the voters. And it's my thought is around a cool-off period. Let's say it fails. What's to stop folks from perpetually just doing again and again and again every election cycle, or even just special elections for this ballot process, and just the general fund always picking that up. So just open to that discussion. And I see the city managers.
There we go. We can say we only pay once, but I would also like, before this is brought up and we go through the process, I'd like to have outreach. I'd like to have survey. If this is totally going to fail, we shouldn't do it. If we have a chance of getting this passed, just like we do with our measures, and we go out and we do surveys, I think that that's really important.
So there's something that can be said here in some bullets further up from that note. So, for example, the interest at XX%. That is something that was written in here as a suggestion to have a discussion on, simply because what level would the city council like to set that level of interest at? Because the Prop 218 process does have a minimum threshold for passing new rates. Do you want that interest threshold to be higher than that to potentially avoid that issue?
What's the threshold for Prop
18?
Mr. Mandel, I think it's 50%.
50%.
For plus
Yeah,
one?
Prop 218, the mail ballot is 50%, but it's weighted by the dollar amount of the assessment. So if different homes have different assessments, then then some of them will have more votes than others. So really, what I think is being talked about here is that it's really a 4-step process. First step is that you ascertain interest. The second is that you engage the engineer to do the engineering study, and you mail out the ballots. And the third then is you count them. And what YS gave is the threshold that's required in the balloting in the election. The gauging interest is a different process, because that's you're saying it's informal, where you're essentially doing informal polls and talking to people, or it's formal, where you're asking the proponents, the neighbors, to essentially circulate something that looks like a petition. And if they are circulating a petition, then getting a 50% threshold is very different on a petition than on a balloting. It may even be harder, because on the petition, you're talking about requiring 50% of the property owners to affirmatively sign a document, and somebody's going to have to be going around circulating it. whereas in the balloting, the city is mailing out ballots, and you're only comparing the ballots that say no versus the ballots that say yes. So 50% interest in that preliminary step may actually be a harder level to reach than the 50% in the balloting.
So that I'm sorry, I'm gonna add on a little bit more to that. So that definitely, that informal process it's definitely not considered an exact science. And there are different ways that you can do it. And one of the ways that I've seen as an example from other cities that they actually request members of the public who live in those districts to conduct the polling rather than staff. So that way, well, not only is staff not spending time on it, but that way also you're having buy-in from the community itself.
Yeah.
And then you can also spend time putting language together that says, okay, for your poll, is interest measured by percentage of responses or is it percentage of property owners? So there are different ways you can do that.
Yeah, thanks for elaborating on that. Yeah, I mean, I like the fact that he should be driven by property owners that reside within that district. You know, let them do the hard work and let them come back to us, showing that there is, 60% of those homeowners interested in doing that, then we can move forward.
So I'll say the two policies that I've written in the past were both at 66%. And that was, as Anthony mentioned, was property owners, not necessarily staff going out and doing that polling. It wasn't really as formal as Mark was mentioning, and as Mark indicated, depending on how you do that polling, gives you an indication of what that 218 result will be. And I wanted to make mention that the 218 balloting is not part of a regular election. I just want to make sure we can mail it anytime we want to, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's not part of the formal election process.
Thank you. I was hoping to correct myself in that in just a moment.
So I would recommend that we go with the 66%, as our Public Works Director has had experience in this area.
If I can ask Mr. Wolf, in your experience, have you seen when the onus is put, I shouldn't say the onus, when the interest in this is placed via policy on the property owners to spearhead rather than staff doing that, have you seen success with that? I just being someone who's worked with community and engaging people and getting folks willing and wanting to go towards some kind of common goal, I know that that's a lot of work. And so I'm just wondering what your experience has been in the success for that.
Yeah, I got a little scar tissue on this from other agencies. So if I start crying, you'll know why. So I will say that I've done quite a few of these in the past in other agencies. And when the outreach and the polling was done by staff, so I have balloted 13 underfunded or deficit districts at a different agency. And in the first balloting process, only about a third of them voted yes. And that was with staff outreach and primary outreach by the staff. So 2/3 of them said no the first time. And then when we did all the things that the council directed us to do, which was turn off the water and stop doing the things that the council directed us to do when there was a no vote, there was a lot of property owners that asked months later, like, why is our grass brown? Why is the trees not being trimmed? Why? Because you voted no, and the council told us, staff, that this is what was going to happen. And so the property owners then took it upon themselves to educate themselves of, okay, now we understand what it meant for a no vote. Then they did a grassroots outreach, and the majority of those grassroots outreach Prop 218 processes resulted in a yes vote. So to answer your question, when it comes from the property owners and they do the outreach and they do the information presentations, normally those result in a yes Prop 218 process than when it comes from staff. So I've seen those. And I also say that typically what I've done in the past or seen in the past is that if a yes vote occurs, the cost of that balloting actually is picked up by the district because now they have funds to actually pay for it. So something you may want to consider in your thought process of if it's a yes vote, you could go ahead and say that now the district will have funds because they've now increased their rates to go ahead and pay back the general fund over time. Maybe you can do, actually, there's the Streets and Highway Code section allows for loans and paybacks. So if we want to, you can put that, we can put that in the policy. As city manager said, potentially maybe it's just a one-time deal and not allow them to vote again. So there's reasons why you may want them to vote the second time, because I've seen success when they voted the second time after they've seen what happens when a no vote happens. So it just, that is sometimes the result.
Thank you for that. I would be open to a hybrid of that, where we're not Xing out staff from the process, but we certainly make it flexible enough that we can have residents spearhead this as well. So that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah.
As well as the percentage,
also,
66%, I agree with that too.
And then I would also be okay with having the general fund pay, and if it passes, having the general fund repay, and if it doesn't pass, then we eat it up. So
Chair MacArthur, we have an additional speaker virtually. I don't know if you want to take it.
Yeah, we can take.
Okay. So
We all
caller ending in 1275, please press *6 to unmute. You have 3 minutes starting now.
Hi there. This is Alicia Purcell. I'm phoning to point out that you need to tread very carefully with these districts defined by Landscaping and Lighting Act of 1972. I don't have the language in front of me right now, but there are very strict limits on the uses of LMD funds. And I'm very concerned about whether some of the things being discussed here are legal to do. I do not believe that you can just set a policy to keep a certain percent as reserve funds. The statute limits you here with there's a theoretical goal of zeroing out the balances at the end of each year, so that residents are only paying for services they get that during that year. But there are two exceptions that were mentioned here were retaining for certain costs, not all costs, certain costs from July 1st till the first property tax payment, and multi-year projects. But other than those, I don't believe you can keep any additional reserves. And I think that's a limitation set by statute. The discussions of surveys and polling is also likely not within the limited uses that the statute allows. And it wasn't that long ago the city lost a lawsuit about similar outreach effort by NBS to ask the LMD residents about converting to DFDs. Court said that was an illegal use of LMD funds, and the general fund had to repay those amounts back to the LMDs. If it were legal, I want to point out that doing outreach takes away from the funds for doing the landscaping services, which is what the LMDs are for. So you're crippling them further. It's just very important to remember the strict legal limits on what the LMD funds can be used for and stay within those bounds. While I'm already making comments, I'll also point out that about a year ago, the city finally refunded the LMDs improper sidewalk grinding charges because the services were done in general fund areas, but the LMDs were billed for it. I exposed that problem. Rabotel kept reiterating it until there was finally action to refund it. But at the same time, I pointed out the same thing happening with tree trimming. General fund areas were being billed to LMDs. And I've been watching for that to come to council for remedy. It never has. When there are improper charges to the LMDs for general fund obligations, that puts more stress on the LMD budget. So if these things would stop, the LMDs would be in a better situation. So I just wanted to raise that issue again since I've not seen it addressed since last year. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Committee members, I would like to let you know that it's 1 minute before the next meeting, so we can go a little over, but I just wanted to make sure.
Is it okay? Just keep on going? I think we'll hit the next 5 minutes. Just a follow-up question on Alicia, who called in. I don't know if we can get some clarity on whether or not it's even legal, like she mentioned, to have a reserve, and also she mentioned about that we cannot, or that LMDs cannot pay for the tree trimming. That is there.
So we do have an attorney, Mark Mandel, who's our legal counsel, so he could certainly talk to the legalities of the Streets and Highway Code section and the reserve, so I'll let him do that. I'll also say that we brought the sidewalk grinding item to council. We did mention in that staff report that we will be bringing any other similar items that we find to council, and we are still evaluating those items.
Thank you. Mark?
And as far as reserves, the Streets and Highways Code does strictly limit the amount of reserves that you can collect. The goal is that at the end of the year, the fiscal year, you'll only have enough money remaining in the account such that you are retaining the installments against the capital projects, and you're retaining no more than the amount necessary to cover that cash flow gap between the beginning of the fiscal year and the date you start receiving money from the county off of the tax bill. And the city has been being very careful to stick below that legal limit. So, and the proposed goal on the reserve, the cash flow reserve, which was that number right around 50%. That would be the maximum legal limit roughly. But you do have the option of setting lower than that.
And with regards to the tree trimming that the caller called in about and said that that should not be billed to LMDs, is there?
Yeah. So Mark, I'll address that if you don't mind.
Thank you.
So in order for us to, we can only assess for the special benefit. And I think the comment is that there is a belief that there are some general benefit that's being assessed for. And like I said, when we wrote the staff report for the sidewalk grinding item, in that staff report, we made a comment in there that said, if we find similar items to this sidewalk grinding, i.e. tree trimming, I think vehicles, irrigation, anything that we find that's similar to the sidewalk grinding that is a general benefit item and not a special benefit that was charged to assessment districts, we would bring that to council and make a recommendation that the general fund pay for that like we did with the sidewalk grinding. We still have not finished that evaluation yet. Okay. Once we finish that evaluation, we'll bring that to city council.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf. Airport Tim, go ahead.
All right, are we good on number 5? Does staff feel they have sufficient direction on that question? I see a thumbs up. Because I feel like the last two are pretty straightforward. Yeah. I think we've discussed already a little bit about subsidies. I'll just say that I don't have any additional input on that. I do appreciate that what staff has laid out for examples here. If a district cannot fund its maintenance requirements, we've already talked about staff reducing expenses, looking at if a maximum levy can be applied, looking at removing district improvements. I know we're going kind of more getting worse as we go down the timeline here, right? Or the process. So with the general fund subsidy, which I've mentioned.
Teron, can I interrupt you really quickly? Let's go ahead and take a motion to go past the 8:30 deadline.
Yep. Okay, sure. I'll make the motion.
Second.
Chair MacArthur,
Yes.
Member Basua, and Member Teran.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Anyhow, that's just my view on that. And then for the capped utilities, are there any additional nuances we need to know about the utilities portion, Mr. Miller?
This can be a difficult item to parse out. Essentially, certain districts had a base rate that was recommended as a part of their original formation. That would be what their budgeted utility cost would be within the district. And then there's language that then further restricts how much that utility payment can be from the assessment year over year from there on out. So for example, if you started at $500 and your utility cost every year from there on out cannot be any more than the CPI increase was from the previous year, your next year might be $503 or something like that. But if your utility rates go up and your bill is $600, the way that that this is structured is that we can't use another portion of that LMD's budget to fund that difference. It has to come from another funding source. So we do not have, or the other opportunity would be to hit $500 and shut the water off. That's a relatively blunt instrument. What we do in practice currently is that we budget for a utility subsidy for districts from a transfer in from the general fund. That is what we do in practice currently, but it's not written as a matter of policy.
Well, I would say for utilities, there's certainly other considerations there. When you mention the very blunt approach of, well, we've hit the max of your budget for utilities for the year, so no more water, right? Or I would imagine, does electricity fall under any of these? I see head nod, yes. I'm guessing that's for irrigation pumps or for, it's not just lighting, it'd be for other purposes. As current practice, we've been having a subsidy for some of the LMDs when it comes to the utilities, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And I'm wondering what staff's position or thoughts are on this.
So we debated this a little bit, or a lot of it, I guess. And part of it goes back to, this was the way we allowed it to be formed. And so because of that, this was the process that we have been using. And we have said that because we have allowed it to be formed this way, then we continue to identify the general fund as the backstop for these utilities in order for them to function as originally formed.
Got it. Thank you. Do you have any, no, nothing? Okay.
Oh, no, I have no questions. I think it's pretty much the same thing. We've already given direction
Yeah.
for 6 and 7,
Yeah.
unless staff needs clarification.
Well, for the utility piece, how do we feel about continuing that practice of either continuing to subsidize using general fund, or do we look at reducing utility usage up to the point of discontinuing utility usage when they get to a maximum budget portion or maximum budget point?
I would reduce water usage. If that's electricity, no, because of safety concerns.
Yeah, I'm okay with the current method being utilized as it stands now.
I'll admit this is a difficult one for me. I don't want them to have dead grass and non-functioning pumps and things, but within reason, I think if we can figure out ways to find operational efficiencies within those utilities, knowing that there may be increases or that they may hit their max budget at some point during the year, if we can plan ahead for that, or as Councilwoman Basua said, look out further ahead of time on that. I would like a subsidy to be a last resort, and ideally not do it. I mean, if we have a may in there in language, great, but we'll have to find efficiencies in there first, especially if that's where we are.
And I will say, in practice, how this works is that a district is only subsidized once it exceeds that cap. So if during the fiscal year we don't ever hit that cap, there are no charges incurred to the general fund. Now, they're budgeted, yes, but those funds are never moved.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that on practical terms. Number 7, it's what happens if a district is serving and chooses not to ballot themselves. I think this is correct the way it's written. I'm okay with that. I don't know if anybody else has any input. Doesn't seem like it, Anthony. Yeah.
Obviously, with me, the general fund subsidy loan thing.
Yeah. I think just with the wording, Anthony, just may is a last resort, for some unforeseen circumstances or something.
And this is more of a priority question, I suppose, is that if it chooses not to ballot themselves, okay, so what steps does staff have to take and what priority? So if the desire is to keep general fund at the very, very end of the list, we can do that. But direction in terms of what steps to take before that is really what the goal is here.
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah, I would like to see, staff reduce expenses, remove district improvements. We can remove all the plants and trees and then we're done. But, and then I guess a maximum levy may be applied. And at that point, we won't need the general fund. We'll just be the desert.
One last thing, and maybe this is more of a landscaping design standards discussion, and we can stop it at that, but I'll just pose out there, if in this policy work, if there's any way to massage in, changing out turf and landscaping for drought tolerant or low water requirements. I'm thinking of LMD 11 where I've had a number of conversations with residents out there where there is no grass left. A lot of it is dirt. And at what point does the Landscaping Act allow us to go in there and utilize their funds or find some way, even if it's volunteers, to change that out to something that no longer requires water or grass cutting? So just throwing that out there too, because we certainly have LMDs, others in that situation. And if there's a way to have some policy around that that's built into this, I'd like to have that there as well. So that's my last comment there.
Thank you. I think we're ready to, and what's the desire of the committee here?
Do we need action?
Do we need action on or is this just?
So it is written as an action item, but I'm going to look at Anthony. I think based on the comments, the volume of comments that we received, I would like to come back to the committee with a little more polished, with a polished document based on the comments that we received. And I think that is where you want to go to, Anthony.
Yes.
Okay. So we'd like to come back to the committee if that's fair. So we don't need an action item if we're going to do that.
Sounds good. Hey, Mr. Blattel, thank you for your comments. Imelda, thank you for your comments and for being here. Thank you so much.
Committee members, you should do a motion to amend to have staff bring it back to committee. To amend the recommendation.
So I will go ahead and amend that staff bring back the committee's recommendations in a draft form.
I will second that.
Okay. Madam Clerk, take a vote.
Committee Member Basua?
Yes.
Committee Member Teran?
Yes.
Chair MacArthur?
Yes.
The motion carries 3-0. Thank you.
Thank you. And unless a member has an item for a future agenda, then there be no further business on the agenda. And without objection,